Hello, everybody. I'm Phil Crook, Meeting Secretary of the RSS International Development Section, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. The stateless are all around us and largely invisible. Many of the stateless know their status only too well, but are reluctant to advertise it. Others are unaware of their status until they try to access their basic rights. Most are untouched by censuses, household surveys, and regular administrative data collection. But they all have rights, and governments have responsibilities. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees are trying to improve a very poor situation. Rada Govil, our first speaker, is a senior legal officer for statelessness in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR, and she will lead us through the tangled web of statelessness definitions without which the statistics would be meaningless. She'll then look at some of the effects of being stateless. Mary Strode, our second speaker, has worked for some years on statistical issues around refugees, the internally displaced, and now the stateless, and is a major contributor to the international recommendations on stateless statistics recently presented to the UN Statistics Commission. I hope you all had a chance to read the briefing paper, which was circulated last week. There are 6 questions at the end, and Mary and Rada are very keen to hear your views. After Mary's introduction, Rada will speak first, and then we'll have a pause for questions and clarification about what you heard Rada say. We'll then go on to the second section, the more statistical aspects of today, with Mary. Please use the chat function to post your comments, your questions, and Jenny Church, IDS Secretary, has kindly offered to moderate these posts in an effort to make the discussion more efficient. Please note the RSS is recording this event, and it will be put into our YouTube collection together with the slides. So if you could now all put your cameras off, please, if you're not speaking. Make sure you're muted. And I'll hand over to Mary.
The first slide, please. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to listen to this presentation on statelessness statistics. Phil has pretty much run through the presentation structure already. I don't want to particularly bore you by going through it again, but I should say that these recommendations are being prepared under the auspices of EGRISS, which is an international group of experts with representatives from international bodies, regional bodies, but also countries, particularly developing countries, but also developed countries. And the group preparing these recommendations is a subset of those members of EGRISS. Now, this is the third in the series. The first was refugees, second was IDPs, and this one is on stateless people. And in my opinion, this is far the most difficult topic for us to tackle. And I think I'm going to talk in the second and third parts about the problems. So I'm going to be bringing you probably more problems than solutions. Rada is going to, in part 1, set out the legal definitions, explain what stateless is, what it isn't, some of the causes, and some of the impacts. And at that point, she'll be showing you a short video, a very interesting video about a situation in the world today and somebody who is impacted. I will then be going on to tell you where we are with IROSS, and then rehearsing some of the many problems that we're encountering. And then phase 3 will be the next steps, where we are and how we fit into the rest of the agenda, international agenda on statistics. Talk a little bit about the decisions from this March's UNSC and the next steps, and then we'll launch into the questions and the discussion. And we're very keen to hear from you and pick your brains about possible solutions to some of the problems that we're going to talk about today. Thank you. Over to Rada.
Thanks, Mary. And Ronan, if you could put it onto the next slide, please. So good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be presenting to you. I think it's the first time that I've presented to a large group of statisticians, which I believe most of you are. So forgive me for not being particularly well versed on the statistical side of things. However, what I can tell you about is the legal side of things. I'm a lawyer by training and work in the legal department at UNHCR. So for those who may think that they have an understanding of what statelessness is or have a sense of what it might mean, few realize that it actually has an underpinning in international law. It has an international legal definition, and that definition is found in one of the two key conventions or treaties dealing with statelessness, being the 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons. And Article 1 of that convention actually sets out the legal definition of a stateless person, which is someone who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. There's a little bit of a mouthful there and lots of different elements, but what it essentially breaks down to is a person who's not recognized as a citizen of any country. And I should mention at the international legal level, we use the terms nationality and citizenship interchangeably. Sometimes they have a different meaning in a domestic context, but at the international legal level, we use these two terms, national and citizen, interchangeably. And when we actually sort of look at what this definition, how it's operationalized from a legal perspective, what's really important to look at here is the view of the relevant state with which the individual whose legal status is being determined has a relevant link. And what do I mean by that? There are different ways that we as nationals have a connection to a state. If you look at your own situation, you realize that you've got your nationality probably from one of two key ways, either because of where you were born, because the country that you were born in has a nationality law that says you were born in the territory, therefore you are a national of this country. A very good example of that is the United States of America, where if you're born on US soil, you get US citizenship. The other main way, which is predominant around the world, is by descent. If your parents are nationals of a country, you gain that nationality because of your blood connection to them. And so what we mean by relevant link is a person who has a link on the basis of birth or descent, but other ways that you can also get your nationality is through marriage, if your spouse can confer their nationality to you after a period of time, or through residence, which is a component of naturalization. So when a state is deciding whether or not someone is considered to be a national, they will look at the people with whom the state has a relevant link. And what's really critical about this definition is that it's not what the individual considers themselves to be. It's not that I think or I feel that I'm stateless. It's the view of the government. And that's really important because sometimes what we see when we look at situations of statelessness is that we look at the law of a country and we say, well, according to the law, this person should be recognized by this government as a national of the state. The law clearly states that they meet the criteria. However, the government, because it's either applying a discriminatory perspective or for other reasons, actually goes against its own nationality law to not recognize that individual as a state. That's actually what counts under the law. What is the view of the government vis-a-vis the particular individual? So that's just to, in a nutshell, explain how that legal definition is put into practice. And statelessness can be determined both on a case-by-case basis and on a group basis. So sometimes we have states where the stateless population is largely migratory in nature, where you're having people coming in from many different parts of the world, and you need to identify whether or not a person is a national. That's usually done on an individual basis. But you can also see situations like some of you may be familiar with the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar, where it's sort of determinable on a group basis because there's a large group of people of a similar ethnicity or background which are not considered to be nationals of the state. Next slide, please. So what is statelessness and what is it not? I work for the UNHCR, which also has a mandate for refugees and also works a lot on the category of persons called internally displaced persons. And sometimes there's a temptation to confuse these three different categories. So I'm going to try and break this down. The first point to note is that statelessness is its own unique and distinct category. However, people who are refugees can also be stateless. People who are IDPs can also be stateless. But that does not necessarily mean that all refugees are stateless, nor does it mean that all IDPs are stateless. Conversely, not all stateless people are refugees and not all stateless people are IDPs. Now, what do I mean by all of that, that big soup I just sort of presented there? Basically, what we're saying is that there are distinct definitions for refugees and IDPs. A refugee is someone who's crossed an international border and who has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And an IDP is someone who's been forced to flee the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violence of human rights, against human rights, or natural human-made disasters, and who has not crossed an international border. Now, going back to the definition of a stateless person, someone who's not recognized as a national by any country under the operation of its law, most such people are actually what we call in situ stateless. That is, that they are found in the country in which they were born and have likely lived for generations. They are not people who have crossed an international border. That being said, we do now see significant populations of stateless refugees. And again, I would point to the Rohingya as a very clear-cut example of that, particularly as a large population of them has now fled to Bangladesh, where they wear those two hats. Likewise, you will find that in certain contexts, there are stateless IDPs, and I'll take the example of Ukraine, which is very much on the top of everyone's minds at the moment. Ukraine actually hosts quite a significant number of stateless people, including stateless Roma, who are in the country. Now, while we're aware that a lot of people have fled Ukraine during this war, there are also many people who have had to move from the cities that are under bombardment, who may be stateless, and they would be stateless IDPs. They have fled within their own borders. So there you can see, again, people wearing two hats. The other point I'd like to make, that stateless people are also distinct from those who are undocumented. Certainly, people who are stateless frequently lack any form of documentation, identity documentation, particularly birth certificates or nationality ID cards where these are required. But it doesn't follow that everybody who's undocumented is stateless. To give my own example, I was born in India in 1980, so I've just revealed my age, but there you go. And at that time, birth registration practices, even in big cities, were not of the best caliber. And so to this date, I don't actually have a birth certificate. That certainly doesn't make me stateless. It doesn't even put me at risk of statelessness. But just to underscore the point that just the fact that you're not documented doesn't mean that you are stateless. Next slide, please. So what are some of the main causes of statelessness? Now, this is something that we could go into in quite a lot of detail, but I'll just highlight 4 key areas where you see real causes for statelessness arising. The first and probably the most important is discriminatory laws. I'd actually expand that to refer to discriminatory laws and practices, because sometimes the law can be fine, but the way it's implemented is discriminatory. And we see this all around the world, from explicit overt discrimination, which, for example, prevents women from passing their nationality onto their children on an equal basis as men, through to quite explicit racially discriminatory laws that actually prevent those of a certain colour or ethnic or racial background from acquiring nationality. This is by far the most prominent cause of statelessness around the world. Moving down, I'd talk about state succession, which I suppose is more of a historical cause of statelessness, but where we still see the effects of state succession continuing to have an impact. And here we're looking at examples like the former Soviet Union, which, when it broke apart, led to its various constituent states, Ukraine being one of them, where the adoption of new nationality laws of each of these states sometimes failed to capture everybody who was living on the territory, and people kind of fell between the gaps. So we've got very significant residual populations of those who were left stateless as a result of those kinds of events of state succession. Probably the most recent example is the separation between Sudan and South Sudan, which has also generated situations of statelessness. Moving to the top right, bureaucratic obstacles. These are the practical day-to-day obstacles that particularly affect those who come from vulnerable or minority groups. So, for example, the fact that you can only register your birth in a major city, and you might live very rurally and find it impossible financially or physically to actually register the birth of your child, or the fact that certain naturalization procedures or forms are only available in English or a particular language, you're not able to actually access them, costs, so forth. That can give rise to statelessness. And then finally, gaps in nationality laws. And here I mean the failure of states to include important safeguards in their nationality laws that would help to prevent statelessness, and in particular childhood statelessness. So to give you a concrete example of this, most states around the world have a provision in their nationality law that says that if a child is found abandoned on the territory and where the parents are unknown, a safeguard to prevent statelessness of that child would be to grant that child the state's nationality, even if you don't know who the parents are. Unfortunately, about a third of the states in the world don't have such a provision, which means that abandoned children sometimes have no nationality. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts of statelessness? And it's here that I'd like to show a short video of an elderly woman who I was actually fortunate to meet a number of years ago from the Karana community in Madagascar. The Karana are a stateless community in Madagascar and are an example of a combination of, in terms of causes of statelessness, a combination of historical migration. The Karana are an Indo-Pakistani community that migrated to work in the agricultural sector in Madagascar, combined with modern day discrimination that prevents them from acquiring Madagascar nationality. And you'll hear about some of the impacts that statelessness has had on the life of this woman in this video. So Ronan, if you wouldn't mind showing the video now. Thank you.
Tsisy nationalité zaho, tsisy carte, tsisy ino, tsisy ino. Raha tsisy karatra, olona tsisy karatra ratsy be mihitsy. Akory ataoko, sahala biby ny tena. Zaho teraka eto, babanakay teraka eto, mamanakay teraka eto. Ata zaho fa mandeha manambady, tsisy karatra mipetraka foana, matavitra foana. Misitrika zaho matavatra. Zaho matahatra tsy afaka miboaka, matahatra pôlisy. Matahatra be mihitsy. Rehefa misava-kara tantray marena amin'ny tanàna misy savakara dia misitrika zaho tsy miboaka mihitsy. Zaho mamonjy anakay, mahatonga anakay fiala anakay tena. Tsy niditra école mihitsy, tena tsy mahay école takely. Tsisy copie bako, tsy mandray ilay mpampianatra. Dia mipetraka foana anatin'ny trano dia mianatra zetra. Dia zanako jiaby zao fa nahazo nationalité, zaho koa mila. Rehefa manana io zaho dia mazoto amin'izay zaho miboaka an-tany mandeha aiza mandeha aiza. Zaho matanjaka zao matavitra be mihitsy aho tsy afaka miboaka mihitsy. Mahazo nationalité zaho dia mandeha mitsangatsanga, miavako any zaho, mijanako any zaho, jerijery andreo any. Zaho ko reo mitomatomanina zaho tsy afaka mandeha amindreo any. Manafitra anakay bebe, ave bebe, zaho tsy afaka, zaho tsisy. Mila mitsangatsanga manao roho fo tsara madio, mandeha mitsangatsanga tena falifaly. Mahatsara fiara anakay io zaho dia toy malahelo be.
Thank you, Ronan. If you could go back to the slide, please. So as you can see, the impacts of statelessness can be profoundly debilitating and can last a lifetime and sometimes generations as statelessness is passed on from one family member to the next, particularly where there isn't an intervention, a law reform that stops statelessness in its tracks. And as you can hear from Sugrabe Ibrahim, the first and foremost area of impact is in terms of socioeconomic rights, potential exclusion from education, from employment, from healthcare, which has been particularly acute in this recent pandemic situation, the right to hold a bank account, rent or own property. These are just very fundamental human rights that are immediately impacted as a result of being stateless. There's also the obvious lack of civil and political rights. Stateless people can never vote, and they also are unable usually to participate politically. There are also severe impacts often on freedom of movement, and obviously legal representation and the ability to present oneself in a legal capacity are also very limited. There's also the increased risk of detention, including indefinite detention, because the view is, well, this is not a person from this country, and in fact, this person has no country to which they can be deported. So stateless people often languish indefinitely in immigration detention. There's also general increased vulnerability, particularly for women and children, to different forms of exploitation, including sexual abuse and physical and psychological hardship, as well as poverty. We've had a couple of recent surveys done in Kenya and in Lebanon, which have quite starkly shown that stateless people fare much worse than their citizen counterparts when it comes to living below the poverty line. The results there are quite dramatic to be seen. And ultimately for society as well, you have a situation where, particularly where you have large protracted situation of statelessness, you have alienated, marginalized communities, which can, in certain circumstances, cause instability, conflict, and ultimately displacement. And I think examples such as Myanmar, where we've seen conflict and displacement be particular hallmarks, but also in Côte d'Ivoire, where the failure to recognize large parts of the population as nationals was actually one of the key ingredients that led to civil war. Next slide, please. And so now we head towards the thing that we're all here to talk about, which is the numbers. How many stateless people are there? And this is really a tricky question. UNHCR does not have good numbers on the global number of stateless people. At this stage, we only report 4.2 million known stateless people, or those of undetermined nationality, and this is based on data coming from 94 countries who report figures on statelessness. And I have to say that even of those 94, the figures are sometimes partial, they're sometimes estimates, they're not always state-collected figures, they're sometimes figures provided by NGOs that are sort of endorsed by the state, but just to say that we have quite a patchy picture, and we know that actually the true number of stateless people globally is many millions more. It's just not clear exactly how many. And you'll see that on the diagram, we've also put in the number of people who the World Bank have estimated have no identity documents. That's 1.1 billion. And as I mentioned earlier, being undocumented does not automatically make you stateless. However, most stateless people are undocumented. So the true figure is somewhere between 4.2 million and 1.1 billion, which I know is an enormous range, but goes to show you that the true number is likely to be much, much higher than the one that we report. Next slide, please. And finally, what does the organisation I work for do about statelessness? Well, UNHCR is actually the UN agency with the UN General Assembly mandate to identify and protect stateless people and to prevent and reduce statelessness. And UNHCR works particularly under the pillar of identifying stateless people to work with states to help them to locate and understand the situation of stateless populations and to try and better count them, because what we found in our experience is that states are much more likely to take action when they have concrete data that stateless communities actually exist, and can also show that the actions that they're taking to address statelessness are having an impact on that number. So it's become even more critical in recent years for us to be able to have that data and to work with states to obtain it. In terms of data collection efforts, UNHCR does also undertake its own data collection exercises, both qualitative and quantitative. I gave you a couple of examples from Lebanon and Kenya recently. However, we don't really have the resources to do these exercises at a national scale. And it's quite difficult with statelessness, as Mary will explain, because these are, even though they're the impact of statelessness is great and the number is relatively high, it's, I think, if I've got the terminology right, still a statistically probably insignificant number given the overall number of people in the country. And it does make it difficult to motivate, I think, statistical authorities to pay special attention and gather data on this particular group. As I mentioned, UNHCR reports statistics provided by states and others on statelessness and undetermined nationality in its annual global reports, and those are publicly accessible, so you can look and see how we report on those figures. So I'll stop there, but open up for any questions or clarifications if anyone has anything that they'd like to ask me before Mary takes over.
Oh, thank you very much, Radha. That was really absolutely fascinating. Jenny, how is how are the questions coming?
Nothing so far. I think Radha's been very clear.
Yes, it was extremely clear. Well, okay. In that case, shall we carry on? I'm sorry, Radha, but no. Congratulations on not.
No problem at all. I'll be around till the top of the hour, so I can take questions at the end as well.
Okay, thanks. Over to you, Mary, then.
Thank you, Phil. Next slide, please, Ronan. So I'm now going to be turning to the statistics side and talking about how we've interpreted the legal definitions into something that might be collectible statistically. But I have entitled this presentation Counting the Uncountable. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of problems, and I hope some solutions might come up today. Next slide, please. So this is where we are. We've been working on this now for a couple of years. It started in Bangkok in the margins of another international meeting, and then we met again in Ankara in Turkey, and a number of countries came forward, I think Philippines and Kenya, to give us some rather positive examples of being able to count stateless people. So the subgroups set off and started to work on a draft IROSS with different countries drafting particular chapters. And then COVID hit, and we found it particularly difficult to solve some of the problems that I'm going to be talking about today remotely. So we put it on hold for a bit until such time as we can meet face to face and really start to thrash these things out. But nevertheless, we have a full draft, and we were able to go to the UN Statistics Commission last month and got endorsement for the work that we've done so far. And they've also pointed out a number of areas where they'd like to see us do more. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So I just should say a couple of words about EGRISS. This is the expert group for refugees, IDPs, and statelessness statistics. This has been going, I think I became an on and off consultant for them in about 2017, and it was certainly in existence then. It's a selection of experts from a whole range of organizations. The IROSS goes beyond the legal definition that Radha has just explained, and it includes those who are reported as stateless, either from administrative data collected by governments or self-reported. And it goes on to include a category that we called undetermined nationality, which are those that have no proof of nationality and are likely to have a real difficulty in getting it for the reasons that Radha has just explained. And we are disaggregating these categories into country of birth, because depending on where you're born, a different route is followed for actually gaining citizenship. It also fits in with the new international migration statistics, which again disaggregates populations by country of birth. Next slide, please. So diagrammatically, this is what it looks like. Stateless persons, these are people who don't have any citizenship, are classified through either self-declaration, which is something that RADA's worrying about, or by administrative data from government authorities. Then we have the really tricky category, the persons of undetermined nationality. They lack proof of citizenship, may be entitled, but they have links to more than one country for all those reasons that we've just heard about. And these can be real, or they can be perceived to be real by the authorities. In other words, as Rada just explained, it depends on the government opinion. And then we have a third category, and this third category, stateless related persons, corresponds with similar categories that we had in refugees and with IDPs, because we recognize that the impact of statelessness can be very long lasting. And those people who've previously been stateless or are living in households with stateless people have particular vulnerabilities. So to qualify for this category, people are either previously stateless and or are descended from stateless parents, or are living in a household with another stateless person. Next slide, please. This is the way we're more used to looking at it as statisticians. We have, in scope of our proposed statistical framework, we've got the stateless people by country of birth, the undetermined nationality, and we're looking for a nice term to describe these two categories, these two vulnerable categories, and we've come up, I think, with sons, but whether we stick with that, I'm not sure. And the impacted population, which is the stateless related category. The real difficulty that we have is, how do you distinguish those people of undetermined nationality from all the other 1.1 billion undocumented people? And the circumstances of those people that might be at risk of statelessness and will have real difficulty in getting citizenship will depend on the country in which they're living. And this will differ from country to country, depending on their laws, depending on their regulations, depending on their procedures, depending on the point of view of the government. And it can be any one of those things that I've listed, and maybe others too. The place of birth, your migratory background, your ethnicity, even your religion, your parents' nationality, maybe your grandparents' nationality, or even earlier than that, or perhaps the language that you speak, your nomadic lifestyle, many, many things. So how can we collect that kind of data to come up with reliable estimates of the stateless and undetermined nationality population? So this is the real thing that's troubling us at the moment. Next slide, please. Why are they so difficult to count? You know, besides it being very context specific and varying from country to country, there are other problems that we have. And as you heard from Rada, the whole concept of statelessness is complicated and not many people understand it. We heard her speak about Côte d'Ivoire, and there was a big survey, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute, where it was found that the concept of nationality and statelessness was not widely understood by the general public. And despite statelessness being very widespread, more than half hadn't actually heard of the term. Again, we get back to this problem that there's no universal global means of identifying undetermined nationality people. Very country context specific. the whole double counting issue, which Radha explained. And then we also have this problem if you're living in a community where people don't have identity documents, don't have birth certificates, you might not even know that you're stateless, and you won't self-identify as such. When we get into a migratory context, it becomes even more difficult. How is the immigration officer in Calais or anywhere else in the world to know if this person that turns up as possibly an undocumented migrant, perhaps seeking asylum, whether they're stateless or not? So it's a very complicated question to ask about. Next slide, please. Not only is it difficult to ask about, but there are particular problems because stateless people are by definition not citizens, so they lack the same protections. So they're reluctant to identify themselves in data collections. If it becomes widely known and they're living outside their ethnic community, if they're distributed generally in the population, it may become stigmatizing if it's known by your neighbors. If you're living in a country where there is a reasonably hostile environment, you may not want to draw this to the attention of the authorities because there will be a risk from immigration enforcement. You're not a citizen. What is your right of residence? And also because they're not citizens, they may not be able to register their vital offence. There may be laws, there may be bureaucratic obstacles, there may be prejudice that can prevent the undocumented and non-citizens from registering their births and other vital events. So they may be severely undercounted in administrative data too. Coming forward to register vital events to get yourself into administrative data might be very risky because administrative data is not usually collected under statistics legislation. While data might be protected under statistics legislation if collected in a survey or a census, administrative data may be very, very risky to get involved with. Next slide, please. Now, because of these vulnerabilities, even asking questions about legal status and citizenship may have an impact on response rates. And this has recently been a big issue in the United States Census. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we come on to data sources and quality problems. People are not wanting to come forward to reveal that they have a different citizenship quite often, or that they're stateless. I think public trust, we may have statistics laws, but as the census, US Census shows us, there may not be too much public trust. And with population registers being widely introduced globally, the stateless are at risk of being left out and further marginalized because they're not in the data at all. Next slide, please. That's a lot of problems. Where are we now? So let's start with the population census, the big one. Now, one would think that this is possibly the starting point. Most censuses ask about country of birth and citizenship. And indeed, in the 2010 round, the previous round, 2/3 of countries did. We've asked countries to start thinking about including in their coded list of nationalities the option for none or the option for stateless. In 2019, Kenya did that. It asked both about ethnicity and nationality. Statelessness in Kenya is often driven along ethnicity lines because the law entitling people to citizenship states the various tribes and ethnicities who are included. So how did that go? The post-enumeration survey found much lower numbers than expected, and people felt much safer to self-identify with other known Kenyan tribes who were entitled to nationality, or not to provide any information at all. So we think what we have in the population census is, yes, it's useful. Yes, there are other questions being asked which may help us to come up with better estimates, but we're likely to underestimate stateless people. The United States Census did not ask about nationality. It was quite a controversial case, and it went to the Supreme Court. The argument was that it would affect response rates and that it's possible to model citizenship and nationality from the American Community Survey. Again, they did a post-enumeration survey, and they found statistically significant lower response rates, particularly amongst the Hispanic community. So even talking about this issue and just bringing it to the public attention is likely to have an impact on response rates, and we certainly don't want that to happen in a population census. Again, the census is starting to be used as the basis, the seed point for population registers in Africa and beyond. If stateless people don't feel comfortable that they'll be protected, if they start to feel vulnerable, they're not going to be in the census, and they're not going to get into that population register. Next slide, please. So what about surveys? As Radha mentioned, it can be a pretty rare population and hard to survey, and possibly not suitable for a general household survey, such as a demographic health survey, a mixed survey, or a living standards measurement survey. Likely to need specialist techniques for selecting a sample with enough people in it, and it can be costly. But we have a couple of examples where it has been successful. For example, Kenya, where the Shona community were not entitled to Kenyan nationality until very recently. They moved several generations ago into Kenya and were not on that list of ethnicities. They were clustered in specific locations, and the Kenyan government ran a survey to both estimate their numbers, collect the data needed to prepare them for citizenship. And in fact, last year they were granted citizenship. In Côte d'Ivoire, there was a large probability survey, 9,000 households or so, I believe, ran throughout the country. Statelessness, or at least the lack of documentation, is very widespread in Côte d'Ivoire and other countries in West Africa because of a lot of regional migration, particularly, I believe, children who were brought in to work on plantations without proper documentation. Very high incidence of risk of statelessness. So we've got a lot of them. A survey could be good, or clustered in specific locations, but otherwise we're going to need specialist techniques, and it can be costly. Having said that, surveys such as the Demographic and Health Survey routinely collect questions about whether one has a birth certificate, whether a child has a birth certificate, which again might be useful for modelling and obtaining better estimates of the stateless. And then lastly, next slide, please. Administrative data. One thing I've noticed is that the countries reporting to UNHCR tend to be OECD countries with good administrative data, and that migrants seem to be overrepresented. Now, there's a great rollout at the moment of civil registration, particularly birth birth registration and obtaining birth certificates, which are really required in order to gain citizenship. In many countries, you require not only your own birth certificate, but that of your parents. Although many countries in Africa and Asia are now moving to register all those born in a country, laws, regulations, procedures, entrenched attitudes can often prevent stateless people or even undocumented people from being able to register vital events. And even where laws are changed, often it's still not possible to extract that birth certificate or to register that vital event. And again, we come back to those data protection issues. If I'm a stateless person, is it going to be safe for me to go along and register my vital event? Next slide, please. So just about at the end. So it's going to be, going forward, very important for us to align with relevant other global statistical initiatives, particularly the Legal Identity Agenda and CRVS. We have to make sure that when this is rolled out and vital statistics are improved in many countries, that the changes in the law, regulations and procedures match the needs of stateless people. We've already aligned our proposed framework with the new migration statistics framework, and the round of population and housing censuses. It's important that the options of none and statelessness are added, even though we know there's going to be an undercount. Next slide, please. So what did the Statistics Commission have to say to us last month? Well, they fully supported the IROSS's development. They approved its basic structure and invited us to submit the complete recommendations next March. There was concern about the ability to operationalize these complicated concepts and definitions, and I've explained why. Much greater emphasis on data quality for the reasons that I've just spelled out. We must include recommendations on the measurement and analysis of the characteristics of stateless populations. And this is such a complicated area, it's certainly going to need capacity building and effective national coordination. So all that must be addressed going forward. Next slide, please, and I believe last slide. So we have now a calendar for completing the IROSS. We went to the UNSC, I've just reported on that. We're planning to have a face-to-face meeting to thrash out some of these issues, maybe next month or possibly June. Then over the summer months, we'll be finalising the IROSS draft with more country examples. There'll be a global consultation in the autumn with both UN member states and interested experts. And the final IROSS will be submitted in November 2022, and we're crossing our fingers for March 2023. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my part. So I believe that we sent you a whole bunch of questions to think about, and Radha will be taking over from here. You've heard enough of me, and Radha will be, I hope, is it Radha or is it Phil, taking over to promote this discussion and get some feedback. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was yes, a lot of things to think about. Jenny, how are we doing in terms of comments and ideas to solve all these problems that Mary and Radha have?
Right. Okay. Well, first question is from Ian Russell. Would you like people to articulate their own questions, Phil, or do you want me to repeat them?
Well, it depends. It rather depends how many questions we've got, Jenny. So
yeah, well, not too many so far. So I think we could perhaps get Ian to ask his question.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you both for absolutely stimulating talks this lunchtime. Thank you. So my question is, what do you think to incentives to registration? So, for example, biometric means of creating bank accounts for the receipt of benefits. And that's a kind of initiative that the World Bank has been involved in, particularly in India. Interested in your response to that. Thank you.
Could I just say before you answer that, we've got a related question from Maya Glickman. How can we incentivize the system and its components? Maya, do you want to just elaborate on your question?
Yeah, well, it was inspired by the previous question, which in a way asked about incentivizing the individual. But to me, in this context, it's probably more important to incentivize the system in scenarios where local officials are perhaps discriminating against certain ethnic groups or other minorities. For example, I have some involvement with Dalit communities in Southeast Asia, where the local officials will often refuse to carry out a registration in some circumstances, even if the law provides that it should be carried out. So the question really becomes, how can we incentivize the system to do what it's supposed to do?
Thank you.
Mary, do you want me to say something or do you want to respond?
Go first, please, Radha.
I'll just say a couple of things on this. I think it's actually both. It depends on the circumstances. I think it's often the system that needs to be incentivized, and that is that sort of, as you've said, Maya, at the local level. There is that need, but I think it's sometimes the individual. Sometimes the individual is unaware or doesn't know what the benefits might be of, say, registering a birth. And sometimes you get the response, well, why should I register? There's actually more of a burden on me than any benefit I would get from the state, particularly in states where there isn't really great social security. People just feel that it's a unnecessary scrutiny and incursion on their lives, and they're not really getting anything out of it. But as we know, birth registration is particularly important, and that's for a whole host of reasons, including things that are sort of looming on the horizon, such as things like climate change and climate disasters, where you can have situations where you're displaced without documentation, or there's no records, and can lead to real problems down the track. So I think that there is a need on both sides, and as the question as to how you incentivize, I think for the individual, it's really about explaining exactly what the risks are of not registering and not being documented. I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but I think more broadly and systematically speaking, I think people need to see that there is a benefit, an immediate and tangible benefit, and often people do. I mean, often things like school enrollment and so forth are linked to having birth registration, so people do see that benefit, but in some cases they don't. And as to the systemic level, I think that there are some other important arguments to be made as well. A lot of developing states are quite concerned about attracting the development dollar, and that's often linked to actually having a sense of how many people the development aid is going to, and also from the perspective of things like tax revenue. People aren't on the books; they're not contributing to the state economy through tax payments and so forth, and this also has a development impact. So I'm speaking in very broad lines here, but just to give a flavour of the kinds of ways in which incentives might be delivered.
Yes, if I could come in here. I mean, I think the first prerequisite is to have a state that is friendly towards stateless people and devoted to trying to eliminate it. I think people won't come forward in a hostile environment, no matter what incentive you offer. If I thought there was some chance that I'd end up in a detention centre, I'd need a pretty big incentive. Now, as we start to move to a world where more ID is required and more digital ID is required, I think we're faced with a rather unpleasant science fiction scenario of where we've got the people who are documented and the people who are not, and out there ready to be exploited. So I think it's rather important that we make sure that we can capture people without citizenship in our administrative data. Otherwise, we're going to have these people who are kind of outside the system. So I think there are a number of things to address as we start to roll out civil registration in particular, which is to make sure that we've removed those obstacles, such as needing the birth certificates of your parents. I just wonder, in Africa, for example, how many people would have birth certificates for their parents? And that we start to move towards registering all, and also making sure that everybody has a birth certificate. But this needs a state which is committed to making sure that it doesn't penalise or harass those people that don't fall into the normal categories of citizen. I think that's the first prerequisite. And as we moved away from surveys and censuses to register-based statistics, I mean, we'd start to have a number of people who are completely outside our statistical system. We just won't know what's out there or what problems they're experiencing. So I think it's quite important. And I don't think we can just say, let's forget about them and let them get on with their quiet lives.
Well, could we perhaps pass to Denise Livesley, because her questions are rather follow on from what you've just been saying, Mary. Denise?
Yes, thank you. And can I say I really enjoyed both those talks. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think Mary was starting to answer my first question, which was, you know, if they aren't outside the system, if they're not aware that they're stateless, but they're not experiencing discrimination, why do we need to count them? So that would be question number one. And question number two, I think, is probably more fundamental, and that is, we have a responsibility as statisticians not to collect information that might be misused against people. Are we confident that the information collected wouldn't ever be used unethically to identify people and to discriminate against them? Governments change, and I think recent events in Russia have shown that governments are not always benign. And we know that in the last World War, census data was used to identify minority groups inappropriately. So really an ethical question about should we be encouraging all countries to collect this information?
Mary, should I answer the question about, you know, whether we should collect data where people aren't being discriminated against?
Yes, I think you should.
So on that question, I'm personally not aware of any stateless population, whether they're aware of it or not, who don't suffer detriment to their lives. I don't think that that's the case. I mean, I think people learn how to cope with not having basic human rights, but of the various stateless groups I've spoken to, most are acutely aware of their statelessness. Even if they're illiterate and uneducated, they know that they are stateless, and they're acutely aware of what they're missing out on. The examples are so varied. They're from the smallest to the biggest things. You know, it's, for example, Pemba fishermen in Kenya not being able to apply for fishing permits because they don't have a national ID card, which means that they can only catch non-commercial quantities of fish, compared to their neighbour who can go out with a massive trawler and catch whatever they need and want. You know, I just don't think that exists. And quite separately to that, and this is from a legal perspective, everybody has a human right to a nationality. it is it's a fundamental right, and I think that it sort of goes to your second point, Denise, that you never know what will happen. Maybe you're in a situation where you can live a relatively idyllic, quiet, unassuming life. You then come in with a government that has really nationalistic tendencies and says, I'm only going to, I want everyone out of here who's not Muslim, who's not Hindu, who's not Christian, and suddenly your lack of citizenship does become an issue. So it may not be an issue today, but it will invariably become an issue tomorrow. So I think that there is a responsibility to count. As to the ethics of it, I'm going to pass over to Mary, because I understand that there are standards around data collection that need to be respected, confidentiality, privacy, so forth. So maybe Mary, you want to speak to some of that and anything else?
Yes, I mean, I take Denise's point that do we really trust the statistics legislation? We know that it's been abused in any number of countries. And my response to that would be that we should collect data, but maybe we should reduce the burden of proof on the respondent in order to register births, in order to be part of a population register. In other words, collect less data about them, make sure that all births are registered, that we don't have to identify people's ethnicity, that everybody is on the population register, and that the burden of actually being, if you lack nationality, having some very clear pathways for people to obtain citizenship, rather than trying to just forget about the problem and leave people without the ability to exercise their rights. I think it's a nice thought, and I think that thought passed through my mind early on in the development of these recommendations. But as things have gone, and I've heard more from Radha and her colleagues about exactly what happens to people who can't prove their citizenship, and certainly during my many travels around the developing world, I believe that it's becoming increasingly difficult to operate without an ID card, for example. I think we can't ignore it.
Okay, did you want to come back at all, Denise?
She's gone.
Sorry, I've gone silent. No, those were very helpful answers. I still think that we have a responsibility as statisticians to. I don't think we have a right to collect any data. And therefore, I think we have a responsibility to stop and think about what are the benefits of collecting this data versus the risks of doing so. And although we know how to protect the confidentiality of the information, if a government is determined to identify individuals, then I think there is a risk there. So I do think it's an issue, but very helpful answers. Thank you.
I think another answer that might be, and there's a parallel group that's looking at modelling and estimation, that if we can identify the factors in countries that might lead to statelessness or being a member of the undetermined nationality population, we might be able to estimate that rather than collect the data about specific individuals. I had a long conversation some months ago with Herman Haberman about the American situation, and that was his response, was that we shouldn't collect data about individuals unless it was in a safe context, such as a country like Kenya, who are committed to providing all its residents who are stateless with nationality, that we should actually take steps to try to be able to model and estimate the data rather than collecting it directly. There is another way to go.
that actually takes us to a question from Kim Bradford Smith. Now, Kim unfortunately has had to leave us, but if I just read her question out, with all the challenges, risks and sensitivities, data modelling does seem to be a good place to start. Has any work started on that, as I'm aware that UNHCR has set up a joint data centre with the World Bank? And in my own parenthesis, we did have a talk from Paddy Brock after our AGM back in December, who'd recently started working at that joint data centre. But the question is, has any work started on modelling these data?
Jenny, it has, and actually we've got Sebastian Steinmuller on the call who's working exactly on this project. So Mary, unless you wanted to jump in first, I think Sebastian can speak from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Sebastian will give a much better answer.
Excellent.
Thanks. I'm not sure if I'm going to give a much better answer, but I'm going to try just to summarize what we've been doing in the modeling work so far. And thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm Sebastian, also from UNHCR, from the Statistics and Demographics section. And indeed, we have been working on statistical and demographic modeling of stateless population sizes, to be precise. And that's been, as was mentioned, funded by the joint data center between the World Bank and UNHCR. So we've been doing that work for around 1.5 years so far, and we at least by now know what's possible and what's not possible. Modeling, statistical modeling, and especially demographic modeling can definitely play a role and is going to have to play a role in obtaining better estimates of stateless population sizes, and also in telling us how much uncertainty we have in our knowledge, including our expert knowledge and our data situation on stateless population sizes. For example, one thing we can do, and it's pretty obvious, stateless populations are populations, so we can apply demographic models to them. For example, normally we've got data points at one point in time on stateless populations, be it, for example, for the Shona in Kenya, where there's a single study in 2019, we know that population size. Now that population in particular, luckily, has been granted citizenship, but we are still looking at the data to understand how this population would have changed in the past. And we've got, for example, on that particular population, we've got some expert knowledge, some community knowledge on how big that population might have been in the early 60s when most of the Shona came to Kenya. And then we've got that other study in 2019. And for the time in between, we can apply demographic models to estimate stateless population sizes. And by trying that, we can hopefully apply these models to other populations in the future. So basically, you're still working with a demographic balancing equation, but you might have to adjust it a little bit. For example, there are more ways of exiting a stateless population, for example, through marriage to nationals or through nationalization directly. So this becomes a little bit more complicated. Furthermore, you can't simply assume that, for example, birth and death rates are the same in a stateless population as in the national population. Furthermore, we can, and we've started to try a little bit how we can think of probabilities of statelessness in particular segments of the population. And the US example is very interesting here. There has been a larger study from, I forget the year, I think it was 2019 as well, might be wrong there, that has been basically looking at groups of migrants to the US who might be at a particular risk of statelessness, and to get from that concept of at risk of statelessness to stateless people to people who are de jure stateless, models can help us doing that. I now quickly want to come to the limitations of modeling. what is not going to happen is that we are going to be able to get a global estimate of stateless population sizes through modeling alone. Simply because we don't have enough data. To do modeling, you need at least some data. And then obviously we can make assumptions that enters the models to, for example, forward project such populations or to impute parts of the data we don't have. But if the data is too scarce, and globally seen it definitely is too scarce, we can't just model our way through all these gaps. So this is definitely one of the lessons we've learned over the past year working on that, really looking at data and really trying to think of models. This is not going to work for all the countries in the world with the data we've got right now. And as a last point, one extremely important lesson we've learned also is, given how scarce the data is, community and expert knowledge, so a lot of more qualitative data sources are going to be really important in the modeling. And we're looking specifically at including such knowledge as Bayesian bias in demographic and statistical models. Hope this gave an overview. Happy to answer any further questions on that, and then over to Radha and Mary again. Thanks.
Thanks, Sebastian. Unfortunately, Kim, as I said, has had to leave the session, but she'll be able to access the recording, so she'll be able to hear how her question was answered.
I can see a hand up on my screen.
It's me.
It's Phil. Yes, I'm sorry, Phil. Have I taken over too much?
Not at all. Not at all.
There are no more questions in the chat.
Yes, no, I was looking at that. Well, just one final one from me. I suppose you're proposing that countries, agencies put in place essentially a new system for collecting information on the stateless. So, have you already presented the justifications for this, the arguments for and against it? Have you shown people what the cost benefit of this will be? I can imagine, you know, some countries may suddenly discover, gosh, we've got far more stateless than we thought. This may be a future issue, as Radha and Mary alluded to. It's something we need to take care of. No, I just wondered, what was the argument that persuaded you to say, because nowadays, sorry, I'm not stressing this very well, nowadays we can't just go ahead and collect data without having a business case. So what is the business case?
I think the business case will depend very much on where you are in the world. The African Union is, I think, committed to eliminating statelessness, and several ESCAP countries and some of the regional bodies are also committed. Once you have that commitment, it has to be a political commitment to go forward. And also, I think the Statistics Office also has to think, as Denise rightly said, about the risks which might be involved. So there needs to be a pathway. And I think Radha has outlined some of the risks of not collecting it. But no, we haven't done a cost-benefit analysis, but you make me think that there needs to be a particular advocacy section on why we should do this. So that's a new thought. I haven't thought about it before. There may be others on this call who have.
Just add a couple of points on that, Mary. I think you're right. I think that there is actually demand for it from states. In 2019, UNHCR organised a large event for governments and others. It was a pledging event where we invited stakeholders to sort of commit to addressing statelessness, and they were able to do so across a range of different areas. And one of the areas that received the most pledges or commitments was in the area of data collection. So states are very interested to do this, and I think that they want to get a handle on the numbers for various reasons, but also because, you know, a number number of states, as Mary said, have actually committed to eradicating statelessness. Now, how do you eradicate something if you don't have a baseline to know whether you've achieved your goal? So I think that it's very practical reasons for one. But I think from UNHCR's perspective, you know, we're an important stakeholder in sort of promoting and pushing for these recommendations. You know, we have a mandate to identify stateless people. That's written into our four-pronged mandate. And so far we've done so in a very patchy manner. And it's not really our responsibility to go out and sift through national populations and find the stateless people. States do have the mechanisms and the ability to do that, even though it is a bit like counting the uncountable. It still can be done. And so I think for us, there's a business case because we need to meet our mandate duties to support states to do that. But I think what's important is that we do have quite a number of states that themselves are interested in doing this and have come to us for that support. And we're interested in achieving a level of consistency in this process so that one state isn't applying a particular, version of statelessness or undetermined nationality and someone else goes off and measures something completely different. And we do need something that is standard setting for the world.
Right. Okay. So it's internationally standardized, but probably nationally implemented as states themselves see the need, basically. Yes, interesting. Right. Well, I can't see any more chat questions coming in. I can't see any more hands raised. It's 2:20. So I think at this stage, unless there's any late hands, no, at this stage, I would first of all thank Radha and Mary very much on everybody's behalf for two extremely interesting talks. Thanks to Liz at the RSS, Ronan and Jenny for the technical support. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. I'm sure that Radha and Mary would love to hear from you if you've got particular answers to questions in the, not what's the word I'm looking for, not within the confines of this meeting, but by individual communication. Okay, thank you all very much and goodbye.
Thank you for having us, as they say.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. Thank you for helping us organise this.
Not a pleasure.